go slightly over 1 hour, and then I can answer questions. So let me begin by I'll begin by just describing, what the thoughts are that I hopefully will leave you with after today's session, after my speech. So, firstly, to say that the Data Value Hub, we're here to help organizations win with data. We're experiencing an explosion of interest in data analytics, and we're here to help organizations win with that data. The second key point I would make is that COVID-19 has exposed weaknesses in our current approach to health and well-being right across our planet. However, third point being, digital technology already exists right now, which can solve these problems. But in order to solve these effectively, what we lack and what we need and what we're creating is a capability maturity framework. And I will describe in more detail about that. So hopefully these are the points that I leave you with at the end of this presentation this morning. So the first thing to talk about is context, and to mention that, COVID has changed our world. Health has become the primary concern of our time. So we think today is the 8th of September, 2021, but it's not. We've actually been pushed 5 years into the future by COVID. And we now live in a world where we have essentially three new realities. The first one is our well-being as a priority. We put our personal well-being and well-being of our family and friends and colleagues, we now put that first in everything we do, in a way that we probably didn't 3 years ago. So we're more acutely aware of our well-being. The second reality that is hit home very hard is working from home. So what was once seen to be a luxury or a faddish thing, perhaps, is now an essential part of how business gets done. Video conferencing in preference to face-to-face meetings or face-to-face conferences. And these two forces together have led to the third. They have accelerated digitization. So the digital technology that was already available 3 years ago is now much more adopted, more widely, bigger, faster, in a way that we really couldn't have imagined 3 years ago. But just to talk about healthcare briefly again, just to make the point that healthcare costs are rising. Before COVID even happened, healthcare costs around the world were rising. And the US has been leading that trend to the degree that this year, the US will spend a quarter of its GDP on healthcare. Now, in 1960, the United States was spending about 5% of its GDP on healthcare, a much smaller GDP. So something is structurally out of order with healthcare spending when it gets to that level in a society. And we're at the dawn of an era in which that will change very radically, and for the benefit of all humanity right across our planet. Briefly, with just one slide to talk about the Data Value Hub, we help enterprises compete by focusing on data. And there's three ways we do that. We work with an enterprise around digital readiness, digital operational readiness assessments. We work with enterprises on specific incubator projects to demonstrate the power of artificial intelligence concepts. And we also run technology upskilling events to further develop those capabilities in society. So the other key point I want to make is that I'm a part of the Digital Health and Wellbeing Consortium, which is being led out of Maynooth University here in Ireland. And we're working with 15 different organizations to rapidly create version 1 of the capability maturity framework for digital health and well-being that I mentioned at the start. So they're the thoughts to leave you with at the end of my presentation, hopefully. To talk then about this topic, what I want to do is firstly pull us into the future and think about the world of 2050, which is 29 years away, and the future, the strange thing about the passage of time is that the future always feels as if it's much further away than the past. So if you go back in time 29 years versus go forward 29 years, we always feel that the past is nearer to us. It's a phenomenon in how our minds work. But so, 2050 will be here much faster perhaps than we can imagine. When we blink, we miss it almost. So I'll also talk about the world of today and the current reality, but also the importance of taking an ecosystem view on all of this. Now, when you think about an ecosystem view, that's again in some ways a radical departure from how things are currently being done. The innovations, then I'll talk about, what are the major technological innovations that are taking place in digital health. In particular, I'll talk about quantum computing, and then the need for a better way. When I talk about the need for a better way, how do we work better within the healthcare sector, which is my focus of my talk this morning. How do we work better to get a better experience for everybody involved in healthcare, and what strategy is emerging that we're working on, and then why Ireland? Why are we doing this in Ireland? And then what are our next steps? So that's the flow that I'll follow, right? So I'll start by talking about 2050 health. So 2050, in 2050, we can expect to see a world in which life expectancy is well over 90 years for the vast majority of people on our planet. That's a world in which, if we look in at different parts of the world, we'll be seeing in countries like Japan and France and Italy, life expectancy of 95 or more. In India, life expectancy touching 85. Here in Ireland, around about 90. I mean, these are extraordinary numbers when you think about where we've come from with life expectancy on our planet. But also what's very interesting is that when you look into the current time, just to pull back from 2050 briefly, we've just passed last year a very interesting milestone. There are now more people on this planet over the age of 65 than under the age of 5 for the very first time. So we have this aging population. So not only are we all living longer, but the proportion of us who are over 65 is growing and growing. And by 2050, 16-17% of the world's population will be over the age of 65. When you look at, well, where are all the people? I mean, the population growth in India will continue. China will have plateaued, but we will see a major shift in where are the people. So China will have more than 1.5 billion citizens. 60% of the world's population will be in Asia, East Asia, South Asia, and if you include Africa into that, that together makes 60%. So there's a big shift in where is the center of the world's population. But then if you look at, well, in 2050, what will be the dangerous things that will be moderating life expectancy? And the number one will be, drug-resistant bacteria, primarily. That'll be the biggest, cause of early death in the world in 2050. But also there's hope on that horizon. I mean, that's the stark reality on disease, on aging. But the hope on the horizon is that it's a world in which a person's health is monitored in real time. A digital twin, a digital life equivalent, collecting data, spotting early patterns and preventing long before the need for a serious operation in your life. The early warning signs will have been detected, and a preventative regime will be offered to you. Nothing is ever obligatory or mandatory in health, but getting to know much earlier about a potential heart attack is much better than having a surprise heart attack. in 2050, as part of all of that, the patterns will have been identified not only in the specific individual, but in large populations as well, connecting DNA patterns, diet patterns, exercise patterns with disease, and how behavior influences all of that. So a much better understanding will have arisen and will have moved into the digital realm and will be in daily use. So it's a world in which we'll be taking a life cycle approach to human health, much in the same way that we take a life cycle approach to aircraft health, and increasingly to the health of your car, your automobile. So you'll understand your DNA, you'll understand the data, and you'll understand what to do. And the medical profession will be working in concert with this in a much more ecosystem manner with technology providers, as well as primary and secondary care providers. An example of a company already heading in that direction is the organization Genuity. Now, Genuity happens to be based in Ireland at University College Dublin, and it possesses Europe's largest genome bank. So 500,000 people have had their DNA measured, and the aim here is to, from that data, identify transformative therapies to help people right across the globe. So it's a very interesting early stage organization focusing in on these concepts around connecting genomic data, DNA data with the overall approach to preventative healthcare. So if you then say that's fantastic, 2050, but what about today? What's going on right now in 2021? Well, we live in the pre-digital age of healthcare right now. We are essentially in the dark ages when it comes to digitization of healthcare. We have typically a focus on symptoms rather than root cause, a focus on a specific problem rather than the overall system, and a focus maybe on isolated data without really understanding broader root causes and more effective diagnosis. So problems are treated in isolation. So someone has a sore knee, the knee is examined, but what about the foot, the hip, the leg? That's not necessarily looked at. The whole body, as opposed to the specific issue with a person's knee. So that's changing, and digitization will change that. But then if we look at looking at health statistics, just to peer back in time prior to 2021. So if you look at life expectancy on our planet, back in 1800, the global average lifespan was 29 years. So terrible diseases everywhere. Life expectancy had crashed in the Americas, in Asia, in Africa, as a consequence of European colonialization and spreading of diseases. By 1950, that damage was starting to come to an end. But if you think about when India gained its independence in 1947, life expectancy in India in 1947 was 27 years. And shortly after it began to rise quite rapidly after independence. But it's quite shocking to think that was the life expectancy after 200 years of brutal colonialization of India. By 2015, India's life expectancy, since independence, had leapt up to 68 years. And right around the world, you can see how in Europe, the average life expectancy, by 2015 had risen to 81 years. Australia, 83, Japan, 84. So the world has been on a trend of increasing life expectancy as we now move, here we are in 2021 with these numbers. If you look at what are the leading causes of death today in 2021? Well, when you look at global data, the number one and number two are cardiovascular related, heart disease and stroke. And then the next two are lower respiratory infections and pulmonary dysfunctional related. So they're lung related illnesses. And then the much smaller numbers below that. So the heart and the lungs are the two areas where we find the leading causes of premature death, in the world of 2021. If we look then at World Health Organization data, United Nations health data, one of the leading problems behind these numbers relating to heart illness is obesity, and then other illnesses that relate into that. Diabetes, type 2, cancer, Alzheimer's. These are the illnesses of developed countries. So in the current way of things, as nations become more and more developed, as calorific intake shifts upwards and diet shifts to a more meat-based or fat-based diet, you start to see these other things have an effect. So if you look at a comparison between 1961 and 40 years later, you can see where the calorific intake has exceeded. So if you look at the United States, which went from a sort of a healthy, 2,400 calories per day, where it's gone to over 3,600. So the average American is eating 50% more food per day than that person should be eating, if you take that data in terms of health advice. And that brings with it a whole range of health issues. And then that contributes to why the US is spending 25% of its GDP on healthcare. But right around the world, this trend is there, that the world is overeating, if you like. If you then look at cancer rates per million, it travels with that. It travels with that data. So as calorific intake goes up, you see cancer rates go up. You see other illness rates go up, and they stick out. The correlations are there in the data. Now, what's very interesting about heart disease deaths per 100,000 inhabitants, those rates are low in the United States. I'm not here to pick on the United States all the time, but it's interesting because there's so much data. It's a very interesting country to study when we talk about this topic. But so the death rates from heart disease in the United States are lower than you might expect because of medical intervention. So what's happened here is that in response to the widespread problem of heart disease, the medical profession in the US has developed a very strong competence in treating that at all its various levels, culminating in perhaps a heart transplant, addressing blocked valves, blocked arteries, etc. So all the various treatments and interventions. And that's why the death rate from inflammatory heart disease has fallen in the United States. If you think of respiratory disease, that's largely related to smoking. So where countries have dropped their consumption of tobacco, the death rates have dropped as well. Diabetes, the diabetes rates, type 2 diabetes rates are high where there's a very high consumption of dairy and other very high glucose and energy intensive food. So the data is there. I mean, it's all there, and it gets updated. And there are many other medical conditions that the World Health Organization studies at a global level. But it's interesting when you start looking at the data to try and correlate. What's root cause here? What's going on? We don't want anyone to have a miserable health experience in life. So what can we learn from that? And that's why it's important to study the data of today. As we also continue this topic of studying the data of today, it's very interesting to look then back a little bit back in time at what have countries been spending on health. So if you look at healthcare spending and how that's grown over time. So if you look at, for example, in the United States, since 1960, wages have grown by 16% in that intervening time. This data goes up to 2010. So from 1960 to 2010, wages up 16% per capita. But healthcare spending per capita is up over 800%. So it's a very, very distinct difference there. When you look at per capita spend, per decade of life, and compare perhaps the 5 most expensive countries, the highest spenders, if you like, you can see that between the ages of 10 and about 50, they're all spending about the same. Less, $4,000, $4,000 per capita in those age brackets. But when you get to 80, 90, you see how the US has broken away from the rest, and the cost of healthcare skyrockets up. So you get to $45,000 per capita for someone in their 90s. So this is why overall it's 25% of GDP. So that's an extremely interesting chart to understand why is that different. I mentioned the GDP spend. If you look at how that's changed in this set of OECD countries, we can see that the US has gone from, as I mentioned, 5% in 1960 up to 16% by 2007, and now heading to 25% in 2021. And then when you aggregate it up and you average it all out, it means that per capita in the United States, the spend on health per person of any age, from birth all the way through, is over $10,000. So you think, what is happening here? If you look at Italy, where it's about $3,400, or India, $200. So there are big differences here. And understanding where this money is being spent and why is critical to understanding the right course of action when we talk about digitizing healthcare. So when we talk about just on that, what's possible? Well, right now, it's possible to look at these 14 different areas of instrumentation which can act as preventative measures around health. So right now, at low cost, the technology currently exists to do this. So we've seen the rise of smartwatches. So a lot, many of that's the Samsung watch, but if you look at Apple Watch, others as well, Huawei and others, there are many watches now in the market which can measure your heart rate. As those devices become more sophisticated, they will measure more and more aspects of your health. Many people will use Fitbit and other similar devices to measure their exercise. So they're starting to understand, how many steps per day, or how much exertion per day, which is all part of health. But all the other areas of measurement of blood pressure, temperature, etc., all these other things are possible right now with current technology. And what we're going to see is these instruments are going to become cheaper, better, faster. With the rollout of 5G and other communications technologies, it becomes easier to connect. Data storage is becoming cheaper all the time. Cloud computing becomes cheaper all the time. So the cost of computing, the cost of communicating, cost of data storage goes down. And that opens up possibilities for data analysis, which would have been prohibitively expensive 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So the environment around us is also becoming instrumented. So dust in the air, noise pollution, chemical pollution, the temperature, what other environmental factors do we need to know about in order to have a healthier experience? So it's about, how do we measure ourselves in real time? How do we measure the environment in real time? And how do we put all that together with larger population data? So for example, if there's a cluster of people with high temperature, they could be infected with COVID. You can detect it that way. So long before you do a PCR test, you've an earlier detection that there's a cluster of people in a certain part of a city with a higher temperature. That data is available today. It's not being acted on anywhere that I'm aware of, but that kind of data can be used to trigger a quarantine or some other intervention long before the pathogen has a chance to spread more widely, for example. So all of that opens up the possibilities of artificial intelligence. So what we're talking about here is how patterns and correlations and early warning signs, they all exist in the data, but we're currently not availing of that capability and that potential. So if you think about it, in the world of healthcare, what is possible? Well, when you think about, who's providing the care, who's paying for the care, by looking at data in a more sophisticated manner, looking for patterns, looking for predicting outcomes, that's a great way to reduce cost. Once you understand something, you can intervene earlier. So if someone on the call is an early candidate for a terrible heart attack, it's much better to find out as early as possible about that, and it's much easier and cheaper and less painful to resolve that 10 years prior to the actual heart attack than when you're having the heart attack. So prevention is better. That's the point as well in relation to diagnosis. Earlier and more precise diagnosis is possible when we apply artificial intelligence principles into healthcare. The world of biotech, when you look at, and pharma, when you look at how drug discovery works and modeling how proteins interact, all of that is much faster and easier when you apply AI principles in the world of healthcare. So right across a vast array of areas, it's in this chart, it's broken into those five, pharma, biotech, health, IT, diagnostics, payer and provider. But if you then say, okay, what are good examples of this? Blood diagnosis, pain analysis, prescription drug analysis. There are many areas where the application of AI is going to make a big difference, is already starting to make a big difference in this domain. But in the absence of an overall framework, these are arrows being shot in the dark, which is why a capability maturity framework is so important, and that's what I'll move on to shortly. Another example of a disruptor is a company called iCarbonX. So they talk about being a digital guide for life. So when you know your particular genome, you can then ask the question, what is someone who has the same genome as me experiencing with their health? Someone who's perhaps 20 years older than me. So if someone with your exact genome, 20 years older than you, has a number of health conditions, that should be very interesting for you to understand. How could you prevent a crisis? Because now you know what the crisis for your specific genome might ultimately be. Examples of genomic differences would relate to things like lactose intolerance, gluten intolerance, and other dietary related issues, as well as other aspects about how your digestive system works, your cardiovascular system uniquely works. The more you understand it, the more you can do something about it. So the analogy here would be with your car. So perhaps you own a Ford Mustang, and say I own a Volkswagen Passat, right? So if you take either car to a general car mechanic, they can fix that problem. But if you have a more peculiar problem, a general mechanic will damage that car because they won't understand that it's a Ford Mustang, a 2015 petrol engine Ford Mustang versus a diesel engine Volkswagen Passat 2021. They're very different. So when you understand the genome of your car, suddenly the diagnostics and the way you care for the car are uniquely appropriate to that make and model for spare parts and tuning the engine, etc. But if you take a generalist approach to car maintenance, you can accidentally damage the cars. So in the same way with your genome, when you understand what it is, you then realize, well, my medical pattern is not the same as every other person on this planet. No two people are the same after all. But the more I understand about my genome, the more I can understand about my digital guide for life. And that's the principle behind what iCarbonX are talking about. So I mentioned earlier the ecosystem view. So each of us live within a society. We have our own genetics that we've inherited from our parents. And also we work within an ecosystem which contains many different stakeholders. So for your health, there is, there's perhaps the need, if you go to a hospital for diagnosis, the different stakeholders that play a role in this, the pharmacy, skilled nursing staff, physicians, these are distinct players in health that are in orbit around your health. So when you then think about taking a patient-centric view as opposed to a siloed view, so the traditional view would be to say, here is the hospital, here is the medical university, here is the insurance company, here is the government funding scheme, here is the pharmacy, here's the pharmaceutical manufacturer. These stakeholder groups traditionally optimize and organize in silos quite naturally, because it's the span of control and influence that they possess, right? But that's not necessarily the right way for you when you are a patient. You would like to think that they're all talking to each other and that they all have a greater understanding of your particular need. But that's not always the case. So when you look at those different stakeholders and break them into those types that I mentioned, you start to recognize that they are not communicating. They've never had to, there's no incentive to, and it's also been too expensive to, and there's also been issues around data privacy. So time and time again, data privacy crops up as a barrier. But if we took the same view to airline safety, nobody would get into an airplane, because you would be aware that no one talks to anyone in the realm of aircraft safety. So you know what? It's too dangerous. I'm not flying. So when you think by analogy how other sectors have solved these issues with data sharing, it's possible to do it. And where there is a will, there is a way. So what we're looking at is the emergence of this awareness that joined up thinking is needed. So in relation to how do primary care providers interact with universities, how do governments interact with charities, how do startups interact with investors, etc. So right across this ecosystem, there are some tenuous connections, but what we're looking at is, with a capability maturity framework approach, how can we encompass this entire ecosystem and build it all around the patient? Now, when you look at the market for digital wellness and innovation, what you see are innovators moving in right across the whole terrain. So if you map on one axis self-care versus professional care, on the other axis self-paying versus insurance paying, you get to see all these different areas where innovation is currently underway, and that translates into this vast field of startups. So there are hundreds and hundreds of companies around the world who are moving into the realm of digital health and well-being. There are so many opportunities with instrumentation, with big data, with apps, with smart watches that can tell more and more about your health, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of specialists. Another example of a disruptor is BGI Genomics, who focus in on the concept of person-specific advice, very similar to what I've mentioned already, genomically based targeted advice. But they also take have capability to look at improved drug discovery using this philosophy. And what it does is that overall, what they're looking at is patterns. So in their case, they have data on 150,000 genomes. And again, back to the point about looking for patterns in the data. So again, think of what I said about the Ford Mustang petrol engine from 2015 versus the Volkswagen Passat diesel engine from 2021. I mean, they're distinct vehicles. But in the same way with people, the more you understand the distinctions in genomes, the more you can provide a specific person with the correct specific advice on their lifetime health. So when you then move on from that and you say, okay, well, what else can we say about these innovations? What other way, can we talk about these? What specific technologies are we actually talking about when we talk about digital health innovation? So with digital health innovation, there are at least 22 different areas where innovation is underway right now, moving into healthcare. So things that are now very well developed are wearable sensors, medical tricorders, more user-friendly software, gamification software. Those things are, currently, getting a lot of attention these past few years prior to COVID, if you like. But if you look into the future, up to 2030 and beyond, you see some very, very interesting things up ahead. You see things like 3D bioprinting, brain-computer interface, 3D printed drugs, the concept of the digital twin, the digital avatar, and enhanced prosthetics, for those who've lost limbs, enhanced surveillance tools. I mentioned artificial intelligence already, embedded sensors, and very exciting, quantum computing. I want to talk specifically about quantum computing because quantum computing itself is going to have an enormous disruptive effect right across our overall society, but it's going to have a very, very strong and positive disruptive effect in healthcare. So I'm just going to talk about specifically quantum computing. So to put it into perspective and to say, okay, on the call, some of you have already studied the topic, some of you haven't. So the audience on the call come from many different backgrounds in relation to this particular area of technology innovation. So just to talk briefly about it, very interesting thing that caught the world's attention, October 2019, about 2 years ago. A Google research team working with a quantum computer were able to solve a complex problem in 3 minutes and 20 seconds. That same problem, using a quantum computer, that same problem, if performed on the world's most powerful supercomputer, would have taken 10,000 years, as verified in the experiment. So that's an extraordinary contrast. So how can a quantum computer do that? So here is a mathematical problem I throw at you. Write a software program using the world's most powerful computer. Get the best software engineers you can find. Get the fastest computer you can find. Takes you 10,000 years to solve that. The runtime of the algorithm is running and running and running, but we know from looking at it, it takes 10,000 years to execute. You then say to, which is an entry level, because we're at an entry phase of quantum computing, a so-called 54-qubit quantum computer. And in this emerging field where not everyone is a superb quantum computing software expert, but in the emerging field, 3 minutes and 20 seconds to solve that problem. Now that tells you quantum computing is something we all need to pay a lot of attention to. This is a new technology which can do amazing things in certain scenarios. It's not a one size fits all. Just to put it in perspective, if you were to go to if you wanted to go from where you are currently to Dublin, Ireland, you would go to the airport and you would get a jet airplane and you'd fly to commercial airline, you'd fly to Dublin. But if you wanted to go to the local shop near where you live to buy a bottle of Coca-Cola or whatever, you would either walk, use a bicycle, or use your car. So you might say, well, the jet airplane is useless. Yeah, well, it's useless for that. Absolutely it is. But a bicycle is useless if you want to get to Ireland in 5 hours. Okay. So in the same way, quantum computing is not a panacea technology in the world of computing, But as I point out, for a certain class of intractable problem, it is extraordinarily fast. I want to give you a brief understanding of how that works, but start by talking about the benefits. So in the world of healthcare, quantum computing within this decade ahead will massively advance healthcare. We'll be using quantum computing to help with predictive health, faster drug discovery, faster DNA sequencing. We'll be able to make sense of vast amounts of data to the favor of the patient. We will be, when I talk about the digital twin concept, we will be using that alongside quantum computing, and ultimately helping with better decision making, decision support. So quantum computing in its context is part of a broader emerging field of quantum chemistry, quantum communications. In particular, what we're talking about when I talk about it is the realm of quantum algorithms, quantum machine learning, where we're working with data. But this is an amazing emerging field. You might say, well, where does it all come from? What is the origin of this? Well, a very eminent Nobel Prize winning German, Max Planck, in December 1900, discovered that the universe in which we live is quantized. Energy, space, and time at the micro level, when you examine it and you seek to understand how the universe fundamentally works, you discover that the universe at its micro level is essentially digitized. Quantized means digitized. So we live in a universe which has at its most elemental level a digitized structure. So energy can only exist at certain levels. It cannot exist at any level. Energy can only exist at certain levels, and space and time follow the same principle. So you might say, if I said to you, what is the minimum length something could be? You might say, well, 1 nanometer. Then I might say, well, what about a half a nanometer? And we get into this debate. But what Max Planck discovered was there is actually a limit in that thought experiment, which is Planck length. And the same applies to time. If I asked you what's the minimum unit of time we could use, you might say, well, a nanosecond. Well, what about a half a nanosecond? Is there any? You might say, well, philosophically, there can't be any smallest unit of time. Well, there is, Planck time. So energy, time, and space are quantized. And the peculiar way in which a quantum computer works is based on that reality. The other peculiar reality out of quantum mechanics is that we live in a multiverse. Some of the effects that point to that are found only in very unusual situations. So in everyday life, it is not apparent that we live in a quantum universe, a quantum multiverse. That is not apparent in everyday life. But when you go to the extremes of scenarios, you then discover from the evidence that it points to the mathematics of quantum mechanics. So what's very unusual about this is that this was discovered in 1900. Following Max Planck's discovery, Albert Einstein, also shown in the photograph here, got involved, and many other great minds of that time got involved in this once Max Planck asserted his claim, his understanding, right, which won him the Nobel Prize 18 years later, 1918. But what's surprising is here we are 100 years later, and we're only now really talking about quantum computing. But what they say about that is that new ideas in the world advance one funeral at a time. Incumbent experts with a previously held certainty have to pass away in order for new ideas to emerge. And that's true in all fields of human endeavor, including quantum computing. So for a very, very long time, computing departments in universities took no interest in quantum computing, and the big tech organizations took no interest. It's really only very recently that anyone attempted to build a quantum computer and then try to write software for it and try to understand how to use it and how to do something with it. And culminating in that Google point I made 2 years ago, where Google demonstrated quantum supremacy. As quantum computing emerges, it will it will dominate certain domains. The first area that quantum computing will be applied is in the world of chemistry, modeling how complex molecules interact. That's practically impossible to do with conventional computing. You know, if you take two complex proteins and you try to model how they interact with each other, like an enzyme digesting, say, lactose, how does that actually work? You know, second by second, you know, molecule by molecule. That's in a conventional computer, you can't do that. You can't model that. You can with a quantum computer. So the point being that the first applications of quantum computing will look very like the complex problems of today's conventional computing. If you think about how electricity was introduced by analogy, the very first kettles, the very first heaters, the very first electrical appliances looked like the equivalent appliances from the oven or open fire stage. So if you look at the early kettles, electric kettles, they looked like kettles that had been used, heated over a fire because they were familiar. Similarly, if you look at cars, the first cars looked like carriages. So to be familiar, for people to buy a car, you have to look like what they're familiar with, a carriage. It was only much later that the car took on its own unique shape. And similarly with electricity, only later did it take on its unique full capability. In the same way with quantum computing, we're at that age now where the first applications, the first problems we try to solve with quantum computing look like the problems we're solving with conventional computing. As that moves on, we move into the realm of what are called unknown problems. Number 5, problems that we will be able to solve with quantum computing that today we can't even imagine as problems. So it's quite extraordinary how this will go. So in terms of qubits, you can see this chart is showing that this diagram is showing 5 phases. Okay, and what's happening here is the number of qubits is growing. So right now there are experimental quantum computers with 128 qubits. I'll explain what a qubit is shortly, but as the number grows, you can see how things move through each of these 5 phases into the world of quantum computers with 100,000 plus qubits, where we're able to solve problems that we can't even imagine as problems here in 2021. So a quantum computer uses some very unusual physics to work. A conventional computer is based on bits, zeros and ones. So all of the mathematics governing how a conventional computer works is based on ones and zeros. And then the physical computer, at its mechanical level, is moving ones and zeros around. And it just does it extremely elegantly and beautifully, such as your computer with Zoom. So the audio and visual experience of this entire call, break it down, it's all ones and zeros, right? Conventional computing, classical computing. Quantum computer doesn't do that. What a quantum computer is doing is it's using 2 very unusual quantum mechanics effects, superposition and entanglement. So the qubit is neither a 1 nor a 0, and it's all possibilities in between. It's using probability surfaces as opposed to ones and zeros. The reason why a quantum computer can solve a problem in 2 minutes, which a classical computer would take 10,000 years to solve, is because the quantum computer is connected to its twins in the multiverse. We do not live in a universe. We live in a multiverse of parallel universes that we cannot perceive. We don't have the sensory capability to perceive the existence of the multiverse. The fundamental discovery of Max Planck is that we live in a multiverse. And consequently, you can pull the computing power from the twins of the quantum computer sitting on your desk and pull back the answer from all of those. And that is essentially what's happening at the physical level as to why it's faster. At the level of mathematics, it's the mathematics of probability surfaces. So it's a very different way of thinking about how to design a computer, how to operate a computer, how to write software for a computer. What does one of these look like? Well, firstly, what this guy is showing here is the actual quantum computer itself, which is that small board between his hands. It's in a chamber which is super cooled and protected from external radiation and noise and external forces of any kind, so that you can get the quantum computing effect to work. It's a very delicate effect. So we are at the emerging phase of this technology. But already in the US, over 50 organizations are commercially using quantum computing to make better decisions. I'll give an example of something which, for those of you with a computing background, you may be familiar with this one. So when you learn how to write software at university, if you study conventional software development, you get to learn how to write algorithms, recursive loop algorithms. Now, there are problems in the world which can be converted into an algorithm, and there are those which cannot. So forget the ones that cannot be converted, but think of the ones that can be converted into an algorithm. And within that set, there are those which execute in a couple of seconds. So for example, here's a list of numbers, find me the biggest number in that list. When you learn how to write software, you can quickly write a small program to do that, and it executes in 2 seconds and it gives you the answer, right? Perfect. There are also problems which can be converted into an algorithm, but they take a very long time to execute. One domain of that is in the domain of encryption. So if you look at how data encryption works, it uses a particular algorithm, and the most widely used one is called the RSA algorithm. So it's very, very difficult to decrypt. For example, cryptocurrencies use blockchain to provide security, but the essence of blockchain is from the realm of cryptography. It is very difficult to hack or crack your cryptocurrency private code, right? It's very difficult. It's not impossible. It just takes thousands of years to do it, right? For one Bitcoin, for example. Now, so that's an example of something which can be programmed, but which takes a very, very long time to execute, an impractically long amount of time to execute. Another one, which again is quite a curious one, is the traveling salesman problem. So if you have a person who you want to get to go out and sell cheese, and you tell them, look, here's 20 cities, off you go. And then you ask yourself the question, what is the most efficient way for that person to pick the route that they would take? Now you would think, well, that sounds simple. I can answer that myself without even a software program. But when you get into it, you discover, well, actually, no, there are many, many permutations. For those who play chess, you'd be familiar with the fact that as you make a move on the chessboard, it opens up 2 possibilities, 50,000, million, trillion. When you play chess, and that's why it took so long for computer chess games to emerge. There are millions of possible moves when you're well into a chess game. Jumping back to the traveling salesman problem, it's the same. So if you had a company with 20 shipments on 4 delivery routes, there are over 1 trillion possibilities to force rank to determine what's the most efficient way to do that. So what logistics companies do is they use what are called heuristics. They make an approximation. They say, look, we haven't time to wait for 1 trillion options to come back. So most logistics companies are sub-optimized when it comes to their efficiency. So that's an example of something that if you do that on a quantum computer, the traveling salesman problem, you can solve that in seconds. But a conventional computer, thousands of years, as that problem is bigger and bigger. So logistics is a domain in which quantum computing is currently being used. Logistics is also an important part of the healthcare system. The logistics of scheduling patient operations, scheduling the delivery of medicine, etc. So logistics is right across all our world, and quantum computing is an important part of that. As quantum computers become more and more powerful, they quickly eclipse the most powerful possible ever classical computer. So if you jump 30 years into the future to 2050, the most powerful classical computer which could ever be made will have been made. It'll be the end of the line. If you think of the steam engine, or if you think of any other legacy technology, as you would imagine, it comes to the end of what is possible. The combustion engine, what is the fastest possible car you could ever have with a combustion engine? There is a limit, right? In the same way, classical computing. So about 30 years from now, it will have maxed out. So if you take an example of a problem, find the factors of an integer, so any integer, for small values. So for integer, like, the number 5, 8, 17, 20, a classical computer is faster than a quantum computer for small numbers. When you get into 1,000-bit numbers, so a number with 1,000 bits, like a number like, a big number, right? A quantum computer can find the factors much faster. In fact, a quantum computer, for the most powerful computer, for the most powerful conventional computer you could ever make, the most powerful classical computer you could ever make 30 years from now, what would take 1 million years to execute the program to find the answer, you would do that in 20 seconds on a quantum computer in 30 years' time. So this is a runaway effect. We've already seen quantum supremacy. This is just going to become a more extreme difference between these things. In the world of healthcare, what will happen is the first area that quantum computing, outside of logistics, the big area will be machine learning. So find the patterns in data to predict outcomes. Back to the point around, it's much better to know 10 years before you're going to have a heart attack that you're likely to have a heart attack, because then you have enough time to do something about it to prevent it. But running those scenarios in certain cases becomes very, very difficult in the absence of using machine learning, statistical analysis of data, looking for patterns, trying to predict the future based on the patterns of, large data sets. That's the domain of machine learning. Quantum computing is going to massively accelerate those efforts. I'll just briefly mention two of the great thinkers in this area. One is Love Grover, who he invented a quantum database search algorithm. His algorithm can be used to estimate the mean and the median of a large set of numbers. Now, if you have a small set of numbers, you can calculate the mean in your head. If you have a medium-sized number, you can use Excel. But when you have very, very large sets of numbers and you're trying to calculate the mean, classical computing starts to take way too much time. So Love Grover developed a new mathematics to do this. So he developed an entirely new way of coming at that problem, which we've all learned at school how to do. He came at it in an entirely different way. He invented a new form of mathematics in order to do that. He invented that mathematics before the hardware existed. But if you think of conventional computing, it's the same. So all classical computing uses what's called Boolean logic. So there was a Mr. Boole who developed Boolean logic 100 years before the first conventional computer was ever built. In the same way, we have someone like that here in the form of Love Grover, who's invented a mathematics for quantum computing, which when the physical hardware came about, people realized, wait a second, Love Grover's mathematics works here on this technology. Similarly with Peter Shor, another hero of quantum computing. So his technology contribution has been an algorithm which cracks the encryption problem. So the most widely used sophisticated security today is called RSA encryption, 2048-bit RSA encryption. Peter Shor's algorithm can crack any encrypted data in 36 minutes, which if you attempted to do it on a conventional computer, it would take you 300 million years to do. So straight away, all cryptocurrency, all blockchain-based technology is open to be cracked, essentially, using Peter Shor's algorithm. So this is not science fiction. This is right now. This is technology available right now. When you look into the future, when you look at the recent past as to what's been happening, the computer which Google used to crack the to achieve quantum supremacy was actually a 54 qubit machine. While they have a 72 qubit machine, the one they used was slightly smaller. But we're now moving up into beyond 128 qubits. So we're at the dawn of this. You go back 20 years, it all began back in 98, where a research team at MIT, working with Stanford, Berkeley, Oxford, and IBM, built the very, very first quantum computer with 2 qubits. Very difficult, very unstable, but proved that the physics is valid for quantum computing. And then others jumped in, Technical University of Munich, Los Alamos National University in the US, Institute for Quantum Computing, D-Wave Systems, who I visited over in Vancouver. I visited them in their Seattle office. And then IBM, there was a bit of a lull, IBM, Google. So right now, all of the big tech companies are putting big money into this. There are amazing things beginning to happen. When you look into the future, what you see is a world in which by 2028, we will see major applications in data analytics for quantum computing. By about 2035, all historical data that has ever been encrypted will be decrypted. So any secret message anyone on this call has ever sent, guess what? That's not a secret. Not if that encrypted data is still sitting somewhere on a computer in 2035. It's not. So we're at that level of change. So what's called here the transient quantum supremacy, that's already happened in 2019, and that woke the world up to this. We're moving into the era of what's called post-quantum cryptography, because if quantum computing can hack all encrypted data, well, that's got a data privacy challenge associated with it, as well as other things. So new techniques are going to be needed there. It's also growing in value. It's still a very early industry. Even by 2030, the primary revenue here selling these computers will only be in the region of $9 billion in an industry where we spend trillions per annum on technology. But it is a 33% annual growth rate. So it's one to watch. Quantum computing is definitely one to watch, a major disruptive technology on the way. So just shifting gears slightly to talk about better ways of organizing digital health and well-being. And this is back to my point around the need for a better way, a capability and maturity framework approach. Well, as I mentioned, we're in a world in which there are new realities. Well-being, we put our health first. Working from home is pervasive throughout all our supply chains, all of our domains. And consequently, digitization that was already present has accelerated dramatically. So bringing all this together, we then say, okay, what might the future be? What are we heading towards? Well, we're heading towards a world of a digital twin. So each of us will have our digital twin in relation to our health and well-being. So we will know at any point in time what's our status, what's our risk from all the various things that could go wrong in our health. And that is backed up with understanding our genome, understanding large population trends, environmental risks, and other things. So Dr. Sean Ennis is part of our group. He is very heavily involved in this thinking around, the virtual human. The analogy here comes from, the aircraft industry. So if you think about think about Boeing. When Boeing designed the Dreamliner, the 777, they did that by building a design that was entirely digital. So there was no wind tunnel, there was no clay model. It was a digital design from the start. And then when they went into manufacturing the prototypes and then ultimately mass producing that aircraft, every component had a huge amount of data capture during the process. So videoed, the manufacturing component was videoed as it was being made. The tensile strength, the density, the weight, all these other metrics, all that data was captured uniquely for that serialized part that went into that specific aircraft. And then in service on each flight of that aircraft across the Atlantic, the aircraft generates 140 terabytes of data. So the airlines which are the world's safest are not accidentally the world's safest. They are quite deliberately the world's safest. The appliance of technology and process excellence leads to the safety record that you see with Air New Zealand, Qantas, Singapore Airlines, Emirates, Royal Jordanian, Cathay Pacific, Virgin Atlantic, Etihad, Swiss Airlines, Japan Airlines. They are not accidentally the top 10 safest airlines. They are the safest because they have adopted these principles of prevention, being proactive, managing the fleet in an entirely different way. The worst safety airlines in the world simply don't do that. They just let randomness dominate. So when we look at our health, you can see two very sharply distinct approaches. You can take a casual approach to your health, just see what tomorrow brings, or you can say, wait a second, I know my genome, I know my weight, I know my fitness level, my diet, my calorific intake, etc. I can proactively intervene here. So when we look then at the innovation vectors, a big thing is going to be around certified medical wearables. As I mentioned before, the smartwatches. Right now, today, the data on your smartwatch is not accepted by the medical profession. It's not validated data. That's going to change. All of the manufacturers of smartwatches are actively looking at how to get their watches certified as fit for medical data collection. Another realm that's emerging is biomimicry. So if you think about your senses, sight, touch, taste, hearing, etc., it's possible to have to augment your senses with devices that are 1,000 times more sensitive to light, to sound, to touch, etc., enhancing your experience. So the technology here is moving very fast at all levels. It's becoming cheaper, better, faster, easier to use, more pervasive. Things like 5G open up so many possibilities when it comes to wearables. So just to talk about our strategy, the strategy that we have then, take all of this into account and say, okay, we're talking about building a better world for each and every person on the planet. So what is that going to look like? And the real question is, what would a citizen's health charter look like? So if we were to write a health charter, what would it look like? Well, it might look something like this. We want a world where every citizen is healthy until they're 100. Because guess what? Everybody on this call is likely to live to be 100. Why not? Nobody. Some people might say, well, I don't want to live to be 100. I don't like the idea of being old. Well, if you ask someone who's 99, would they like to be 100? They'd say, yes, of course. So, it's all perspective in life, right? But living to be 100 and healthy is what we really want, rather than living in pain in our old age. So we want a world then in which every citizen is proactively cared for to prevent illness. We want to move the medical world from its expertise in reacting, which it has that capability, and it's important to be able to react. But we want to be proactively cared for. We want a world in which infectious diseases are rare, a world in which things like COVID are detected much, much earlier and locked down and blocked much, much earlier, rather than disrupting every single person's life, as we've seen. We also want a world in which heart disease is rare, arthritis, diabetes type 2, rare, Alzheimer's, cancer, rare. That's the world we want. We want a world in which invasive surgery is rare, a world in which organ transplants are rare. Not rare because we can't get the experts, rare because they're not needed. And we want a world in which physical injury is rare and mental injury is rare. That's the world we want. That's our charter. If that's the charter that we want, then you say, well, how can we do that? Well, we can do that with technology that exists right now. And technology that's emerging will augment that capability. So monitoring leading indicators for a healthy cardiovascular system, or detecting infection by pathogens in individuals earlier, or accelerating vaccine discovery and deployment. These are the dimensions of that charter. And this is showing where current technology can help with that: wearable sensors, machine learning, digital twin concepts. So we can do this. The technology currently exists. What doesn't exist is an organizing framework to do this. And that's where we're doing the research. So if you look at technology management at its most basic level, there are essential functions. So if we're deploying all this technology, whether it's quantum computing, wearables, all the different dimensions, to deploy all of that as a set coherently in the right way requires careful consideration of how we source, organize, how we devise our strategy, our governance, all of that. There is no framework off the shelf that we can say, oh, we'll just use that framework which has been pre-built. We have to create one. We have to create a digital health and well-being capability and maturity framework. And when we look at that, it has to allow us to advance along 4 strategic vectors: the budget, the capability, digital value, and the business model. But what we're doing here is creating a framework which allows us to then measure the relative maturity of digital health. So, for example, we can look at a hospital in Dublin. We can look at the diabetes care in that hospital, and we can say it's currently 2.3 on this model out of a possible 5. And we can say the desire is to be at level 4, and we can then chart, well, how do you go from 2.3 to 4, right? So that's the principle behind this, to determine what should such a framework look like, and then test it rapidly on scenarios just like that one with, say, diabetes care out of a particular hospital in Dublin. But the purpose of this is to create something that has universal application. It's not just for a hospital in Ireland. This is for global consumption. In going about this, we'll also be looking at where is the digital leadership and where are the digital laggards. Right across our healthcare systems, we can currently see really antiquated digital practices, which would not be accepted in a car factory or in an airline, but yet are underway in the medical world. So assessing that as part of our methodology is vital, because what we're talking about is finding ways to introduce next practices. There's no point in just introducing best practices of 2021 when 2050 is upon us. We have to be thinking, what are the next practices of 2050? And our method must consider that, not just build something for today. So the philosophy that we're following here, we call a virtuous helix. So getting academia, the healthcare sector, state agencies, and commercial enterprises to work together to think of what the best possible 2050 would look like. So when you bring in everybody's opinion, what collectively will emerge. So we create version 1 of our capability and maturity framework. There are many standards out there that we're working with: IEEE, ISO, TM Form. There's a large body of knowledge in complementary areas of human endeavor, which we can bring into this. So the benefits of this approach would be that we want to get faster and better decisions. less technical debt. You know, overall, healthcare is expensive. When you look at the IT budgets in healthcare, they're very high as well. But the question is that IT spend wisely made? Could it be more wisely made? Could we remove technical debt? Being able to provide a roadmap for digital investment, thinking of that example in a Dublin hospital again, 2.3 moving up to 4, what's the wisest way to make that move? So the framework we're working on, the actual framework that we're using is adapted from something that began life inside Intel about 15 years ago. So Intel internally developed an IT capability maturity framework, which was put into the public domain through Maynooth University. The creation of the Innovation Value Institute let that move into the public domain. Hundreds of organizations use the ITCMF today. So we have a reference starting point that we are then saying, okay, that philosophy and that methodology is proven. Let's adapt it for the purposes of digital health and well-being. So why Ireland? Why are we doing this in Ireland? Let me talk a little bit about Ireland. I'm from Ireland, obviously. I'm speaking to you today from Dublin, Ireland, our capital city. Ireland is a constituent member of the European Union. Ireland is the only English-speaking country of the European Union. We became a republic at a similar time to India in 1949. We joined the European Union in 1973. We were one of the founding members of the Eurozone, along with Italy. Relatively low population and low population density, relatively high GDP per capita, $94,000, third in the world, and a relatively high human development index, second highest in the world. We have thousands of foreign corporations that have major operations in Ireland. Ireland has a very strong belief in low taxation for business. So invariably, American corporations put their major operation in Ireland when they look at the European market. And when the UK chose to leave the European Union, that massively benefited Ireland. Many organizations simply left the UK and moved into Ireland because they want to be able to access that market of 550 million people. So the other thing about Ireland is Professor Martin Curley of Ireland's Health Services Executive. He's a major part of our effort, and he is in charge of innovation and digital strategy for Ireland's healthcare system. So we look upon Ireland as a living lab in the context of concepts here. So it's all about opt-in, it's all voluntary opt-in for those who get involved. But the point being that Ireland, with a relatively small population, it's easy to deploy a concept, a safe, non-invasive, concept, and then test it in the Irish market and see can it move elsewhere. I mentioned inward investment. All of the world's major biopharma players are in Ireland in depth with major manufacturing and research facilities. The same is true for medtech and biopharma. They're all here. Medtronic, Roche, Boston Scientific, all of the big brands that you're familiar with in the healthcare sector. They're all here, and they're all growing, and they're all continuing to expand. And the same is true when it comes to software and hardware companies. They're all here in depth. So Microsoft's European HQ is in Ireland. Research, operations, all activities run from here. While they have obviously have sales teams right around Europe and technical teams right around Europe. The same is true for Dell, for Apple, for Oracle, for LinkedIn, for Google, for Facebook. The list goes on and on. Intel's largest wafer fab outside the US is in Ireland. So we have within our group participation from medtech, pharma, and big tech. So global corporations that are in Ireland, we are working with them in our consortium. They are active participants with us. The Irish state itself is also providing funding for our major project on developing this. So the next steps, we've developed what we would call a strategy on a slide. So how do we move from the current state of reactive health posture to a future state of proactive and secure approach to health? We've identified 7 key initiatives to do that. The organizations that we're working with, who are now signed into our strategy and funding it, include Roche Pharma, Medtronic, Cisco, Huawei, as well as a set of universities based out of Ireland and a number of Irish medtech startups. So we are in the process now of building version 1 of our capability and maturity framework for digital health wellbeing. We will be piloting that within the Irish healthcare system. We're doing that in a way which will be, publicly done, and we want to see how we can help move this concept globally. The global corporations that are involved have the same objective. They want to participate in Ireland to make this happen, but then want to look at how they can rapidly move that around the world where they operate around the world. So, in conclusion, we need a capability and maturity framework for digital health and wellbeing to maximize the benefits for humanity. Technology already exists to solve many of these problems. We need a framework to get the full value from the technology, but the technology exists. COVID has exposed weaknesses in how we currently go about these things. And the Data Value Hub, which I'm the CEO of, we are here to help organizations win with data. So that is my presentation finished. Thank you very much for your time. Do you have any questions?
Thank you so much, sir, for the nice lecture and informative session. So dear participants, if you have any question, any query, then you can unmute yourself and you can ask.
No questions? Maybe in the chat.
Hello, am I audible? Yeah.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Please.
Yeah, I just wanted to know just your view. In Indian culture, basically, we have Ayurveda, yoga, and sort of meditation also. But
Yes.
nowadays, we are looking into the technology-based healthcare and Medicare. So how you see all this, that ancient things are doing good thing, or they are just out of technology and they have no sense behind it, and we are
Yep. I lost you there for a moment.
Go ahead.
Well, I think I get your question though. So yeah, when you think of when you think of Ayurveda and the whole piece around yoga and otherwise ancient concepts. Firstly, the evidence would be, when you look at the history of Vedic tradition, going back perhaps 12,000 years, maybe more. There's ancient wisdom there, Rig Veda, Ayurveda, all of it, right? So the authors, the original authors of Ayurveda were very aware of the holistic approach to healthcare. So you mentioned yoga, mind-body connectivity, and taking an overall view of a person as opposed to just looking at their knee when they have a problem with their knee. So Western medicine is much more primitive than that in its philosophical starting point. You know, you look at the lung, you look at the knee, you know, you don't look at the person, whereas Ayurveda always starts with the person. And then, you know, bringing harmony into the life with calmness. So I think that this is an essential, you know, philosophical position for the future of medicine. So the digital technology and taking a capability maturity framework approach to it, advancing it, is all good, but it needs, I believe, Ayurvedic principles to really bring it alive. So I think there is a full harmony between the advances we're talking about here and the ancient wisdom. You know, I really do believe that.
Thank you, sir, for your kind words.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other question? Thank you so much, sir, for discussing about the cloud computing technology, their future and applications. You enlighten the history of the quantum computing and how the quantum computing can help to design the research study. Also, the participant will, after your lecture, so biomimicry and health longevity and their roles. So now I would like to request our Dean ma'am, Dean UCRD, Meenakshi ma'am, please appreciate our speaker with token of love.
Thank you, Gaurav. First of all, thank you so much, Professor, on behalf of our organization. And entire management, I express my sincere thanks to Professor John. So, Professor John, kindly accept a memento from our side. Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Namaste. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So the next session will start at 2:30 p.m. So I would like to request all the participants to kindly join sharply at 2:15 p.m. Another speaker, Professor Jaman, will be here with us. So kindly join at 2:15 p.m.